down there. Am I on the mic? Okay. Thank you. As always, it's always a great privilege to be here. I've always enjoyed coming here, and I'm always surprised that you invite me back again. So can't be doing too badly. Since the last time I spoke to you, I've taken up a position as deacon with the church, with my church. Deacon means that I really am a servant of the church, and I'm in my work uniform. This is what I wear to mop the floor, to vacuum the floor, to wash the toilets, and do refreshments after service. So, and one of the privilege of being a deacon is that I have interesting conversations. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to this student, and she has just arrived in New Zealand, and she was telling me about how, in general, she has been struggling. She struggles with understanding how there is so much suffering in this world. She feels that her life is just filled with darkness, and she just finds it really difficult to know, how can we have hope in this world? How is it that things can even, how can she actually find a resolution to her pain and her uncertainty? And we were chatting, and I was telling her that you need to have hope, because from where I'm seated across from you, I see this series of miracles happening in your life. A miracle that has brought you of all the countries in the world, this miracle has brought you to New Zealand. Of all the cities in New Zealand, it has brought you to Wellington. Of all the people in Wellington that you could have lived with, it brought you to a flat with Helen. And of all the people that Helen could have introduced you to, Helen introduced you to me. And if you look at that journey, you've been brought to New Zealand, brought to Wellington, brought to Helen, and then to me. Can you not see that something miraculous is happening in your life? Today, we are looking at a passage in Acts. I understand from Jeff that you have been looking at Acts. And Acts chapter 1 and chapter 2 has been the classic passage on missions because it contains a passage which I will talk about later. But Acts chapter 1 and chapter 2 is really just the one passage separated by a misplaced chapter heading. And it's really divided into a few parts, 5 parts. And it hinges on the third part. So in the first part, the church gathers. And this is where Jesus, post-resurrection, spent 40 days with his disciples, teaching them, encouraging them, and then telling them about the Great Commission. And then after his ascension, when he goes off up to heaven, the disciples gathered 120 of them, we are told, and then they chose the leader to replace Judas. Praying one day in their room, the 120 of them, the Holy Spirit arrives, baptizes the believers, and the believers broke out in tongues, went out on the street. And then the next section, Peter preaches to them, presents the gospel message to them, and as a result, 3,000 of them were saved. And then we end with the final passage. This is the church and community, the church acting as a church, caring for one another, praying, worshiping, and living together in harmony. So those were the 5 passages showing a progression. Now, if if we look at this passage, can you actually see it? Yeah. I'm not going to go through them, right? But these are some of the things that we can observe about the church. Now, when we do Bible study, there is always one of the important things that we need to do is that we need to distinguish between a description and a prescription. A description is just merely, this is what happened. All right? This is what happened, and if you choose to, you could also choose to do that. That's a description. A prescription is, this is what happened, and if you are a follower of Christ, you should also do it. Acts 1 and 2 is definitely a description, but in different church traditions, people might choose to see it as a prescription. Certainly, a lot of church practices that we have, we derived it from this list. That there are certain things which the church did in Acts 1 and 2, which we think is good to do, and so we follow. Things like having a place to meet. Obviously, we think it's a good idea. They met in the same room, and it's interesting that this gathering of people physically, and you and I, we know how important it is after COVID, right? Post-COVID, when we are not allowed to meet, coming back to meet each other, being in the same room becomes really valuable. But Acts 1 and 2, they also talk about, this passage, they also talk about rooms which could fit 120 people. So, very often we talk about the New Testament church as being a home church and being a house church. Well, I'd like to see a house that could fit 120 people. Yeah. I would like to live in a house that fits 120 people. Invite me home, yeah. Undoubtedly, they also met in homes, and they also met in temples. So the lesson that I want to point out is that people gathering together, meeting together, is really important. And then they had leaders, they had a process for choosing leaders, and so I won't go through the list. If you want, take out your phone, take a picture of that list, or request it from the sound guys, and you can go through it on your own. But one of the things that we often do not realize is that one of the things that the church did almost from the very day, in fact, on the very day of Pentecost, on the very day that the Holy Spirit baptized them, was that, wrong button. Oh no, yeah. Was that they stepped out and they testified to the goodness of God to migrants. We often say that, they stepped out and they witnessed. They stepped out and they proclaimed the goodness of God, and we forget that they did it to migrants. These were the nations represented in that list. They were not just pilgrims to Jerusalem. And if we go back to the passage, we hear that on the day of Pentecost, all the believers were meeting together in one place. The Holy Spirit came with a sound like the rushing wind. Wellingtonians, right? You know what rushing wind sounds like, right? And those of you with a fireplace, you know what flames look like. And the Holy Spirit fell onto the disciples, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began speaking in other tongues. And then it says that at that time, there were Jews. There were Jews from every nation living in Jerusalem. So they were migrants, not pilgrims. They were not there just for the short period of Passover. They were living in Jerusalem. And they hear these believers, 120 of them, men and women, and probably children too. speaking in tongues, speaking and praising God. And they say that how is it that we are people from all over the place speaking different languages and we can understand them? And we understand them and we understand them praising God. You know, the conclusion for some of them was that, oh, these guys are just drunk. And I thought, you know, you got to be pretty badass for people to think that you're going to get drunk at 9:30 in the morning. And I think that this movement of people from, you know, within the room where they're praying and then suddenly bursting out in the streets and meeting people who have come from everywhere, at least from as far a place as Rome, from Arab, just there, standing in the street, and then they get to hear about the glorious goodness of God. I don't know about you, but it sends tingles down my spine. Can you imagine how glorious, how wonderful to see that? And this is the fulfillment, or this is not the fulfillment, this is the start of the Great Commission. So in Great Commission in Acts, in the first chapter, when Jesus, you know, was speaking to his disciples, taking leave of them, he tells them, you know, you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And so we see this happening right here in this passage in Acts 2. Disciples stepping out and telling the people in Jerusalem of the glorious goodness of God, witnessing to Jesus. You know, witnessing to migrants, and you see this passage, they were not, they were people who have come into Jerusalem. They were still speaking their own languages, and they were people who carried with them their own culture. And when we talk about that, we often forget that, you know, when they needed that language in order to help them see Christ. But not only that, the disciples themselves, the believers themselves were also migrants. Why? Because when they went out and they started speaking to these people, they were saying that how is it that they know the language? They are Galileans. And how would you know that they're Galileans? It's likely that because they were dressed differently. Peter and Matthew and all